Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second class on uh, forest restoration and rehabilitation. And today we'll be talking about the functions, the roles, and uses of degraded and secondary forest. And you will agree with me that this tries to put a positive perspective to our current situation. From the last class, we went through the categories of forests that we have in the tropical environment today. We emphasized the fact that a large proportion of our tropical forests have either become degraded or are now secondary forests or degraded forest lands. So today, let's look at the role that these forests can play in our lives and how we could harness the benefits or the resources available in this particular types of forest. So degraded primary forest and secondary forest have become predominant in most tropical countries of the world. In Nigeria, remember I told you that our current forest estate is only about within 4 to 7% of the land area, and the majority of this is actually secondary or degraded forest land, with only about less than 1% of primary forest left over at the moment. However, these forests continue to provide protective and environmental functions for us, similar to what we would get from primary forest and old growth forest, even though they may be limited, even though the resources have become depleted over time. And we can still harness the ecological and protective functions of this forest if we can control the agents of degradation in this particular forest areas. Even though the economic role of the primary forest would have decreased over time because the trees may no longer be there, yet we can still harness the benefits that this forest can provide for us. Let's go on. So, like I said, over 300 million people today depend on degraded or secondary forests for their livelihoods. This is where we can still conserve our wildlife, and timber production, even though has reduced, people still go back for harvesting. They still go for small diameter logs and they harvest them from this forest. And these types of forests, apart from supporting the indigenous people's livelihoods and supporting forest dwellers, supporting small scale farmers, they can also help us by supporting improving soil conservation and also increasing or improving the hydrological functions of the various land areas that are around them. So the forests that still serve as water catchment areas can still help protect them. Now, we know that most of these degraded and secondary forests are the ones that are accessible to people because they are close to settlements. People have their farms around them. People get goods and services, particularly non-timber forest products, which they export. About 1/5 of the world's tropical area, farmers there still use shifting cultivation. Over 250 to 500 million farmers still engage in shifting cultivation and fallow lands for land to recover. So these sites, these secondary forests, these degraded forests, serve as safety nets for poor people. And one major resource they also get from this forest, which is very important to rural people's survival, is fuel wood, domestic energy. They get that from charcoal, they get it from fuel wood, And they also get uh, 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 non-timber, non-wood forest products such as vegetables, edible fruits, medicinal plants, bamboo, uh, wild game, which they use as animal protein from these forests. And they continue to serve as important sources of timber for local construction. The local people still go in there to collect timber materials for their building purposes. Even though it may not be able to support large-scale timber production, they still have a role to play. And if we are able to maintain or restore this primary forest, you will reduce the pressure that is the deforestation rates of primary forest, because you reduce the pressure for accessing resource from primary forest. And also, you are able to stabilize small-scale colonists who want to continue to expand their agricultural land. But when you have put policies in place or laws in place to check continuous degradation of secondary forest or degraded primary forest, you are going to limit the expansion mentality of some of these farmers who just want to keep clearing out land for agricultural production. Now, this secondary forest and degraded forest can help with soil protection against erosion. These are environmental services that, even though they are difficult to quantify, but they are there. And when you remove the source of the service, when you remove the forest that provides the service, you are going to see devastating consequences. So, for example, you have regulation of water regime. So the water cycle strongly depends on the presence of forest. The water catchment area, protecting water bodies from erosion, from eutrophication. These are all very important. Carbon sequestration. So when the trees absorb CO2 for photosynthesis, they are helping to remove excess CO2 from the atmosphere, thus contributing to mitigation of global warming. They can also serve as refuge sites for biodiversity conservation. So when you have patches of secondary forests that are recovering, wildlife can recreate habitats in them, and that way you are able to conserve biodiversity. You are also able to protect farmlands, because we have been able to establish a strong link between trees and arable crops. That when trees are present on farms, they improve the quality of whatever comes out of that farm, in terms of products, in terms of services, in terms of protection, in terms of even air quality that come from there. And they also, when you look at this primary forests that have become degraded or secondary forests that are recovering, they can serve as templates for rehabilitation over time, and trying to bring back the services that the forest used to provide for us when we manage them properly. They can also help us reduce fire risk, because of they can help increase the wetness of the soil and reduce the propensity of fire to occur on the land. And lastly, they can help us to conserve the genetic resources of plants and even of animals. Now, remember I mentioned carbon sequestration. It has been established that going forward, the restoration and management of secondary forest and the degraded primary forest will play very important roles in our global carbon cycle, in our quest to combat or control the impact of climate change, in our attempts to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For example, about 42% of the global carbon stock, in terms of biomass, in terms of when you see the trees, the leaves, the roots, that's what we mean by biomass. About 42% of the global carbon stock is found in tropical forest ecosystems. And a large proportion today, because already about half of the tropical rainforest has been destroyed or have become degraded. About half, that's about 3 million hectares or so. So changes in the biomass in this forest will significantly influence the global carbon cycle. And so restoring them, rehabilitating them can help us increase carbon. And I hope you understand what we mean by carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration simply means the absorption of CO2 and storing them in pools. So when you have the forest biomass in terms of the main stem of a tree, what you have there is carbon that has been absorbed, has been used to produce cellulose, and then that cellulose becomes what is stored as the wood. And also you have biomass in the leaves, biomass in the soil because of organic material that accumulates in the soil over time. Let's move on. Let's quickly talk about the socioeconomic and cultural aspects that you as a forester need to be thinking about when you are looking at the restoration or rehabilitation of degraded forest lands or of secondary forests and of degraded primary forest. One perception believes there are different perceptions based on communities and based on their level of development, based on the relationship that the people have with their environment. For example, some believe that primary forests are a major source of biodiversity and therefore we need to protect them. We need to conserve them. That's why all over the world, as you would have seen, if you go to Google, you can look up global maps of protected areas. You see that all over the world, in all countries in the world, they have designated or gazetted particular areas or ecosystems that they protect because of they feel the importance that if you do not protect the forest, you are going to be putting biodiversity in danger. However, even though this has always been the initial goal, protect the area, but that has not been as effective as one because despite protection, we continue to have degradation on a large scale. And then restoration, even though aims to repair damaged forest ecosystem, it usually is difficult to re-establish the initial biodiversity. Once degradation occurs, it's most times difficult to bring back the original dwellers of the ecosystem, of that land area, of that forest. And the costs of ecological restoration is very high. As you would see later on, when we begin to look at the various mechanisms and methods used in restoration, you will begin to see the social and the political realities that tropical countries face today in their effort to try and restore or rehabilitate their forests. Another perspective which those who promote economic development stand on is the fact that unless the volume, yield, and value of a secondary forest or a managed natural forest is comparable to what you get from a plantation, an industrial plantation, it's not worth. Then it's not worth the investment. So, unfortunately, this benefits to cost analysis done by proponents of production forestry ignore the fact that biodiversity in natural forests can in no way be compared to the biodiversity that you have in industrial plantations. Later on, when we get to 500 level and we are discussing forest protection and conservation, we'll come back to compare biological diversity in a natural forest and a plantation, you will see the huge differences that exist. And also, they see that labor-intensive silvicultural intervention as a cost rather than a social asset. So they believe that when you spend so much money to try and restore or try and rehabilitate a forest, you are wasting resources. But they forget that in creating avenues for engagement. So, for example, you are trying to restore a place, you invite the local communities to raise seedlings, and you pay them for raising the seedlings, you pay them for planting the seedlings. You are creating a relationship, you are creating trust, you are boosting livelihoods of the people. They don't look at it from this perspective. They also look at it from the returns when it comes to wood production, because if your aim is just to crop and sell the wood, then yeah, in the short run, in the short term, you may make profit, you may make huge revenues would come in, but what is the associated impact on the environment? There's something we call environmental impact assessment. So how is the environment affected by your cropping activity? What about the social impact on the people who depend on the forest as their home, as their source of livelihood, and as their heritage? Also based on only on the production of small fraction of forest products that have become marketable, and they ignore the wide range of potential new products. So these proponents believe that restoration is not necessary because at the end of the day, what are we trying to achieve? We are trying to achieve profit. We're trying to produce new products. So when land is degraded, why don't you just convert it to a plantation? Convert it to oil palm plantation, and then you can set up industries, you can employ people, you can get agro-allied products from the oil palm, etc., etc. They also ignore the service functions that this secondary or degraded primary forests provide. For example, we have come over time to realize that in terms of the value, in terms of the services, apart from the physical products, the tangible products that forests provide for us, we gain more in terms of ecosystem services, in terms of supporting global issues like climate change, like water recycling, like the nexus between water cycling, ecosystem existence, issues like even the sustainable development goals, the 17 sustainable development goals, where forests play a very critical role in about 4 or 5 of the SDG goals. Let's move on. There's another group of people who believe that cultures and livelihoods are strongly linked to forest. Therefore, they value degraded forest landscape differently. They look at it from the perspective of their ability as stakeholders or as dependents to access products for immediate household consumption. So, for example, going to the forest to collect leaves, to collect snails, to collect mushroom, to feed your family. They believe that you need to protect the forest because of the hydrological function they provide in terms of water catchment protection, protecting your water body from pollution, protecting it from erosion, protecting it from eutrophication. They also believe that there are strong spiritual, religious, and cultural ties with forests. They believe also that they could tap into ecotourism, where people could come to understand livelihoods, understand ways of life, the cultures of people in connection with their forests. So all these contrasting perceptions make it very, very interesting for us when you are trying to propose that a particular degraded primary forest or a degraded forest land or a secondary forest requires intervention for you to improve the quality or the structure of that particular system. For example, people who are urban dwellers, who due to urbanization, they are expanding into new areas to build estates. They may not consider the impact of clearing the forest to build their estate on people who live downstream, particularly if the estate is along or is upstream, or is along a particular river or along a particular stream. Now, some of these other socioeconomic factors that we need to think about is stakeholders' engagement. Looking at all the perceptions and all the perspectives in our choices because of the different values that vary socially, culturally, or economically, we must bring the people on board in our management strategy for us to effectively harness the functions and the roles that this degraded primary forest or secondary forest can play. So in our resource planning, in our management, we must bring the people on board and carry them along. Now let's look at it from the ecological context. We've talked about it from the socioeconomic context, looking at different perceptions and how the people may be affected or may affect the forest. What about the ecological status of primary forest? Let's talk about their situation now. So a degraded primary forest, depending on the length and intensity of use, such a degraded primary forest may retain most of its soil properties, its physical properties, and structural characteristics, which may be similar to the primary forest that was there before. And of course, we know that natural forests, tropical natural forests, are heterogeneous in terms of species composition. You have different species within a 1 kilometer area. You can have over 100 plant species growing together. But without having to intervene using silvicultural activities. So when we say silvicultural activities, we mean going there to plant, going there to weed. This degraded primary forest can recover via natural succession, depending on the level or an intensity of use over time. So, such that it may be able to restore itself back to previous site conditions. Once you have access to seeds, there are seed dispersals, animals that can provide the seeds that will to the soil for natural regeneration. However, these forests are impoverished because of the stand quality. So the type of species that are there, most of the high value timber species would have been harvested. The ones that are left over would have been damaged when we call it residual tree damage. When they are harvesting and the trees are falling over, then they break the branches of standing trees. There may be pests due to opening of the canopy. There may be disease outbreak. The number of trees, the volume of wood are all affected by logging operations. So, and then generally they still have more timber species than what you have in secondary forest, because from last week you see that the level of intensity of degradation increases from a degraded primary forest to a secondary forest to a degraded forest land. So, but you may have a lot of non-economic species growing there, particularly in all the stratas. And an important variable in this forest is the impact of the logging, the intensity of the logging, the severity of the logging, the amount of injury that has been caused to stem and crown of the residual trees that you can still find on ground. And then you find trees that you don't know their age. They look like saplings, but they have been under the tree canopy for long, so their growth has been suppressed, and they may actually be old trees. So, which have been suppressed over time. And one of the major challenges we have ecologically with degraded primary forest is the fact that there is, in tropical environments, there is heavy damage because the level of cropping, of harvesting, is usually very high. And because they do selective harvesting, they point, okay, they mark the ones they want to fell, they fell them, they fell the high diameter logs, with high canopies. By the time these trees are falling over during harvesting, a lot of other residual trees are heavily damaged. And there's also the high risk of degradation of the genetic composition or the gene pool of the highly favored species. So the economic trees that are there that have been harvested, when you have removed the mother tree, they don't have a seed source for their regeneration. However, when we move to secondary forest, which is the next stage, which has been highly degraded over time, but is in the process of recovery. So you have what we call secondary growth. Natural regeneration has started. The process of succession has started. They are going to be less diverse. Within the plots or the sites, you would have less heterogeneity, less diversity, and you have pioneer species dominating. Pioneer species are species that have the ability to quickly germinate and begin to colonize sites once there's an opening, once there's a gap in the canopy. And these pioneer species are dominant at the colonizing phase. That's the first phase. They are short-lived, they are fast-growing, they complete their life cycle in a very short period of time. In FPP 312, we'll talk about natural succession, so you'll be able to understand what we are saying here better. And they are characterized by rapid changes in the structure and species composition of the forest, because there is a rapid succession of a group of plants over time. And the quantity of biomass will approach that of the primary forest within a century, because there is fast growth. You have opened up the sites. You have a range of species that may be able to recover to their full species range over time. And with time, if the place is left to recover, it may be able to get back to the original site quality or something similar to it. And some of the factors that hinder or influence process of succession in the secondary forest include the intensity and duration of the perturbation. By perturbation, I mean the disturbance. The distance to primary forest, which provides seed dispersals that can help natural regeneration on the site. The condition of the site in terms of its topography, its climate, the characteristics of the soil, and availability or access to sunlight. The seed bank, so what do you have in the seed bank? And the ability of roots and stumps of felled trees or of harvested trees to resprout. So you can just follow through to look at the various successional stages as you move from the dominance of pioneer species like herbs, like shrubs, like climbers, to a situation whereby as the site matures over time, the pioneer species will gradually die out after dominating for a while, and then light demanding species are able to which had initially colonized the site, begin to die out, and then you have shade tolerant plants come up and take over in the long run on the site. Now, some of the characteristics that affect uh, floral diversity in secondary forest include the phenology, so the flowering and fruiting patterns of different plants that you have there over time, the regeneration, whether plants are going to be able to regrow from the roots of initially planted, plants that were originally there before harvesting, or they will regenerate from seeds. All these have their influence, and the ability of remnant trees to dominate the site or not. All this will influence the direction of succession and recovery. Let's quickly move. Now, some of the factors that affect productivity in this secondary forest include site conditions, the time since the disturbance stopped, the number of cycles or fallow periods that have taken place on the site, the intensity of land use. If you convert land from forest land to agricultural land, for example, and then you want to revert back to forest, all that will influence the level of recovery and growth. And then you have the degraded forest lands, which are highly degraded, eroded. There is a lot of hydrologic instability, there's reduced productivity, and there's low biological diversity on the site. And it's difficult for degraded forest lands to recover because natural regeneration is hindered by problems like low propago availability, high seed predation from predators, lack of microhabitats that allow what we call seedbed germination to occur. You have very few little seedbed conditions on such sites because of the level of exposure. There is low nutrient in the soil. They don't have what we call mycorrhizal associations as you should in a tropical forest because of the exposure over time. Drought, competition between the grasses and the plants that are trying to reestablish themselves. Fire may be another major barrier, and microclimatic conditions being very stressful for seedling survival and growth. And all these factors are important to consider when you are dealing with a degraded forest land, because the original ecosystem that was there, now you are going to have to rehabilitate. So you need to have history of disturbance and the original ecosystem that was there. You need to understand the pattern of the landscape, and you need to understand how you are going to bring back seeds or seed dispersals, or are you going to be planting on the site, and how to control problems like grass competition with grass, water stress, and limited soil nutrients. These are things you will need to think about critically for degraded forest lands as you try to harness and use them. Now, we have what we call silvicultural interventions for these sites as we try to use them and harness the properties that are there. So in FPP 314, that's Principles of Silviculture, you will be taught some of these silvicultural interventions. But for degraded primary forest and secondary forest, you may not need to intervene silviculturally. You may not, because on such sites there is still the opportunity for seeds and wildlings of harvested trees and plants to regenerate on the sites. So their recuperative capacities are usually very high, even though they have been disturbed over time. And there are a number of economically and socially desirable species that are present on this site, which you want to help to recover. But you need to consider how much tending you need for such site. Do you really need to tend them or not? And what will be the benefits and costs of silvicultural intervention as compared to setting up a plantation or converting the land to an agricultural cropland? So, and some of the silvicultural interventions you could use for secondary forest include refining and liberation thinning. Thinning is simply reducing the density by removing some of the stems to allow those that are on ground, on site, access to grow both vertically and horizontally. So there's what we call refining thinning, which is the elimination of undesirable trees and climbers and shrubs that may hinder the growth of your desired trees. Also, you are going to be creating space for your target species to be able to grow. And the problem with this method is that it may then affect species diversity because you are going to be favoring some species over the other. But what we focus on is how do we encourage those that are in the lower canopy and in the understory layer to be able to thrive and grow vis-a-vis the competition they have with other climbers and shrubs and weed. Now, liberation thinning is the cutting that relieves young seedling saplings and trees in the lower layer, lower canopy, and reduces overhead competition. So this is to stimulate growth from the understory into the upper canopy. So silvicultural interventions need also to be considered as very important policy tools when you are trying to restore or manage or rehabilitate degraded secondary forests. Now, some of the possible pathways for degraded primary forests to recovery include allowing natural regeneration to follow. It's allowing nature to heal itself, and this is a conservation strategy. Managing the wood production or multiple use qualities of the site. Progressive degradation, that is continuing the uncontrolled extraction. So you could also allow extraction to proceed and then you convert the land to a cropland, or a non-forest land, depending on your objective. So these are alternative pathways for a degraded primary forest. Either you allow it to regenerate, you begin to manage it for wood production, where you give people concession to harvest wood, to collect non-timber forest products, or you continue to allow it to degrade. That's another pathway. Or you can convert it to a plantation or an arable cropland. For secondary forests, you can continue to allow it to regrow, so you reserve the land. You can manage the vegetation through fallow system. You can introduce agroforestry because you don't want degradation to continue, so you could apportion some sections for farmers to plant their arable crops alongside tree species. You can convert it to a plantation as well, or protect it and allow it to recover and become a high forest production system for wood and multiple use products. For degraded land, degraded forest land, if you can allow degradation to continue, or you can protect the site and reduce and allow it to begin to regrow. You can introduce planting to try and stabilize the site and begin to manage it for multiple use systems, agroforestry systems. And you could lessen the intensity, you could introduce less intensively managed tree plantations, where you can then begin to produce economically valued wood species, or you could convert it to single or mixed species plantation. These are different pathways for you to develop your degraded land. And then there are policy issues. The problem we have today is that most of the degraded forest lands, secondary forests, don't have sufficient institutional or legal frameworks for them. What we have are for primary forests. But in recent times, countries are beginning to develop legal frameworks for the restoration and rehabilitation of their degraded lands. And I think Nigeria should also harness this and see how we can put policies in place for the recovery or restoration of our degraded lands. All over the country, we have land that needs to be restored. But do we have backing? Do you have political will? Do you have laws? Do you have institutions that will make this happen? What about the people? Community engagement is key if we want forests to be restored. What are we doing to ensure this? We need policies. Policies that are related to marketing forest products from these sites, policies that allow producers to be able to capture the benefits from maintaining this forest, policies that create incentives for people to want to protect degraded forest lands, and then policies that support research on technologies, on and innovation, on community-based participation, on all sorts of interventions that would both provide sustainable development for all parties involved. So I think we will stop here for today. So we'll continue from this point to look at how we can measure degradation in forests. Thank you very much for listening, and have a nice